still joining us, we're just working on getting our meeting streaming. We're having a little bit of difficulty there, so we're just going to wait a second to get that worked out.
We are now live streaming to you as well.
Great. So we are officially beginning the meeting of the Governor's Advisory Council on Climate Change. We are recording and live streaming, and I am going to pass it over to Temporary Commissioner Peter Tester to welcome us and start our meeting. Commissioner.
Thanks, Mariah. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you on behalf of the whole Climate Subcabinet, Governor Walz, the state agency, time and effort that you all have put in to this work over the past year, for your work on the 3 subgroups, for just an incredible perspective and experience that is really going to be critical and is needed more than ever as we have a lot to do and a lot that we have been doing. And we need to do, as the Climate Subcabinet, working with all of you, a better job of maximizing your time and maximizing your talents. And I know that Mariah and Frank are going to spend quite a bit of time later on in the meeting to help us with that. And so I'm looking forward to that. But just a huge thank you for the time and effort everyone is putting into this. And I hope as you'll hear from the governor a little bit later also, he's excited, he's making this a priority, and he's pushing forward on these things now even more. And so hopefully that synergy and that work on the grassroots level as well as at the top level by himself and by others, by the administration and others can really propel a lot of this work that you guys are helping with. I also, as you all know, Laura Bishop resigned as commissioner back on July 6 when it became clear that the Minnesota Senate was not going to confirm her, even after 2.5 years of being on the job and doing a great job across a whole myriad of activities that this agency deals with, including on climate change. And I'm sure as all of you worked with Laura, interfaced with her out in the communities, saw that climate was a commitment of hers, it was a passion of hers, it's what really one of the leading efforts that she made throughout the entire agency was in that area. And it wasn't just in the area of Clean Cars Initiative, it wasn't just in the area of working on the subcabinet, but trying to drive a lot of that work on climate change deep into this agency, into all of the 24 programs that do it. And she really believed in that. She made that just a focus of meetings that we held every week. And obviously, it made her a lightning rod for opponents of climate change and deniers of climate change. It made her a lightning rod for those who were opposed to the Walz administration's efforts on climate and being one of the top 4 priorities of the Walz administration. And lightning rod for Governor Walz himself. And she was always very knowledgeable and candid about, I'm not here to do the easy work. I'm not here to, just pass the time, but to really do the hard work. And if it comes with having to cost my job, she's ready for that. She said that long ago when these efforts were underway by the Minnesota Senate, and when it came to pass in July, she was still steadfast in the importance of willing to take a stand and stand up for policies that were really desperately needed, and notwithstanding sort of the consequence of it. And she had great support from the governor, she had great support from the lieutenant governor, from the cabinet agencies, and from a lot of you guys, amongst other people. And I know that meant a lot to her, that to reach out to her and help her through. I know most of you probably saw or received directly her letter where she talks a little bit about the rationale for the decision she made and a lot of the great work that was done. And I know she appreciated a lot of the feedback that she got. And I think, as we're also going to hear later on, there was a lot that came out of this legislative session, tremendous amount of work on climate change that she helped lead, along with the other commissioners like Commissioner Arnold and Commissioner Stroman and Commissioner Peterson and a whole bunch of others. That was really quite amazing. I mean, I think as you'll hear, more work was done on climate change than was done since 2007, both from a quantity standpoint in terms of the number of dollars that have been allocated and directed, as well as to policies. So that legacy and being able to have worked on that, I know was really important for Laura. And it's sad, it's disappointing that she's gone. But if you know her, you know that she'll remain in public service. She will remain on climate issues, and there's more that she wants to do in both of those 2 areas that once she has a chance to spend the summer and relax and take a little breather, I think she'll be back doing something that all of us won't be surprised at. To that end, I just wanted to say, Governor Walz is not slowing down on climate change at the state. When I talked to him right after Laura resigned, and he and his chief of staff, they were very adamant about this is incredibly important work. We are not stopping just because clean cars was a lightning rod and was something that happened. We are going forward with all of the work that came out of the legislature, all the work the agencies are doing, and he's continuing to press on that. You probably saw some of the news that was in the press and in the papers the last week. We had a clean cars rollout, which was really exciting up at Phillips Temro on Monday, where the governor was there, legislators were there, advocates from the nonprofit world were there, both from the energy side, fresh energy, as well as from sort of health and safety. And he spent an hour and a half taking questions, touring, advocating, really believing that this is the right way to go. And I think it was validated by a lot of what the legislators said at the same time. Yesterday, we had the eco legislation with the Department of Commerce, and Commissioner Arnold was there doing that. And again, the governor is really wanting to push. So I think it was a great week for climate. And for this group, I think it's indicative that we want to keep pushing and continuing to do that. And I know he's urging the climate subcabinet to move forward this summer on a whole host of efforts. And Frank and others may discuss some of those today. So a little bit about me for those of you who I don't know, and that's quite a few of you, but I was born and raised in Minnesota. I grew up in Minneapolis and Prospect Park. My parents were professors at the university. My dad was an ecologist and behavioral biologist, and my mom was a sociologist. So my brother and I spent all summers up at Itasca State Park. The university has a field station up there for teaching, and I spent all of my summers till I was about 15 tramping around in the prairies of Wagon Prairie and up Tamarack Bogs. So the outdoors runs deep in me, and I spend most of my free time hiking and climbing and canoeing. So the fact to be able to do public service in this area that melds with my own personal interests is a real treat. I'm an environmental lawyer by training and had worked for the Minnesota Attorney General's office in private practice with Ecolab for the past, over those three in the public-private sector for about 30 years, and then came here to the Pollution Control Agency about 2 years ago. And I'm just thrilled. So thank you for letting me share a little bit about me, and I look forward to working with all of you. And I have listened in on a couple of the earlier ones. So I have a last thing I'll just say. I have a wife and two girls, twin girls, one of whom is married to one of Anne Mulholland's members. Eric Chen, who works up as a land steward, is married to Christina, and they live up just south of Little Falls and on a prairie that they're taking. And so there's a whole bunch of connections. But thanks very much. Looking forward to working with you. Thanks, Mariah.
Thank you, Commissioner. While I go over some of our opening logistics, if advisory council members and also subcabinet members who are with us would like to chat your name, your affiliation, and a summertime activity you've been enjoying, that would be great. As a reminder, I say these things every time, but I'll repeat them, that we want to try to feel as much like we're in the same room as we possibly can. We're really hopeful that in October we will all be in the same room. That's the plan right now, although we know that with the Delta variant, some things are up in the air, but that's our hope. But in the meantime, while we're here virtually, as always, we encourage you, both advisory council members and subcabinet members, to jump in at any time. You don't need to be, wait to be called on, but you can also raise your hand, which is up in the top right. There's some fun little reaction icons up there, thumbs up and clapping. And even though this is sort of a formal meeting, we encourage you to use those things so that we can really be interacting with each other as much as we possibly can, to chat, comments or thoughts or ideas that you have, and, to try to have a little bit of fun. We can't have snacks at these virtual meetings, but we can still, try to interact and enjoy our time together. And that's true for subcabinet members as well. We have quite a few subcabinet members with us today. In addition to Commissioner Tester, we have Commissioner Arnold and Commissioner Stroman and a bunch of others I'll miss. I think Commissioner Peterson and Commissioner Roberts Davis. So we encourage subcabinet members to jump into, turn on cameras, join us, so that we can all feel like we're as together as we possibly can. Our agenda for today, hopefully you have all had a chance to see it, but as a reminder, in just a second, Frank, who is the climate director at the Pollution Control Agency, along with our council member, Kevin Pranis, are going to talk about the successes and challenges of this legislative session. You know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there was a lot of all of those things, so a lot to share there, and then open that up for some discussion with all of you. And we asked Kevin to present with Frank because he spent a lot of time at the legislature or on virtual platforms with the legislature, was active during this session, so he can share his perspective as well. And then we're going to get just a quick update from Assistant Commissioner Catherine Blauvelt, who's at the Department of Commerce, talking about what's going on with federal climate work and spending. There's a lot happening there, changing all the time. And so we'll have just a quick update there. And then we're going to spend a good chunk of our time talking about the Climate Action Framework. Hopefully you had a chance to look at some of that information that was sent to you ahead of the meeting, to look at the overview of that action framework and the engagement page. So we have two of our leaders who have been working on that, Amanda Smith from the Pollution Control Agency and Faith Krogstad from the Environmental Quality Board, who will give you an overview of the arc of that work, and then lead you in a discussion about the Advisory Council's role, both in advising us on that work as well as assisting us in that work. From there, we're excited to have Governor Tim Walz come and give us some remarks on climate, and then have some time for question and answer with the governor. We'll take a little break because 3 hours is a very long time to be on these virtual meeting platforms. And then we'll hear from three of you, well, all of you, but we'll have a little update from each one of our work groups to talk about what has your process been, what are you working on, so that folks in the other groups know what everyone's working on, and what takeaways or learnings do you have thus far that you might want to share with each other and with the sub-cabinet, and talk about where we go from here in terms of your work groups. And then we'll have Commissioner Margaret Anderson Kelleher from the Department of Transportation will be joining us to lead a broader discussion about the Advisory Council's work, given all of the conversations that we'll have had today up to that point about what are the challenges and opportunities, what's the work that's going on, and how does the Advisory Council best fit into that work. And then Commissioner Anderson Kelleher will also help us wrap up for the day. So any questions about our agenda or check-ins, comments, anything anyone wants to share or ask about before we dive into our agenda? All right, and again, jump in at any time, please raise hands, chat, jump in. But with that, I'll turn it over to Frank and Kevin to talk about this legislative session.
Thank you, Mariah. Good afternoon. Frank Kolash, Climate Director for the Pollution Control Agency. Excited to be able to present this to you. And in my what seems to be normal fashion, I'm going to have to talk quickly because there is quite a bit to go over with what turned out to be a productive session for the for climate-related items in Minnesota. So I'm going to bring up a brief presentation that I have, and want to verify that everyone can see the presentation.
We can see it, Frank.
Great, thank you. So to start, I was looking for a way to describe what happened, at least for the quick recap between the regular session and the special session. It really was a night and day sort of situation that we were facing, especially with the climate related provisions coming out of the legislature. And that at the end of the regular session, looking at the types of climate related provisions that existed in the House version of many of the omnibus bills, there was quite a bit of climate related action within that bills, but within the Senate's omnibus bills, there was not very much in there for climate. We were able to get through the Energy Conservation and Optimization Act, but other than that, there was not much co-joining of the climate related items that we were seeking between the House and the Senate and the administration's purposes. And then within the hearings that we had on some of the climate related items, whether they were advanced by the administration, by the governor, or advanced by legislators, House members or Senate members, the testimony in the hearings was very pointed. It was very difficult There was a lot of questioning of the need and the purpose and the cost effectiveness and the effectiveness for addressing climate change that we faced in this. And so the tenor of the conversations was very tense, very, very confrontational. And certainly within the Pollution Control Agency, we were facing the fact that the Senate's desire to remove our authority to adopt the Clean Cars Minnesota rulemaking was holding up quite a bit of environmental work and environmental protection proposals that we had put forth. And even going back to the 2020 session, it was the reason that some of the LCCMR funding was held up was because of the Clean Car Authority. So it was a very challenging atmosphere and series of hearings to go through with the Senate hearings, but it was very pleasing and light of day when we came to the end of the special session and were able to see that there was a significant amount of climate-related action and funding going towards activities, whether they were specifically for climate or if they were for another environmental or energy-related purpose that has climate benefits. That really we do look at this, and I look at this as really one of the most monumental sessions since the 2007 session, when the Next Generation Energy Act was adopted, and when the Renewable Energy Standard was adopted, and when the Electric Efficiency Standard was updated for Minnesota. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. I'm trying to make sure that we have time for questions and answers, and we do have members of all the agencies here if there are more specifics that I may not be able to answer. But to start with, in the natural and working lands area, I just was putting together what is an amalgamation. So adding up that for cover crops and improvement in soil health, we're looking at $11.4 million, and there's over 4 different types of efforts that are being funded. 7.4 million of that's going to the Board of Water and Soil Resources for grants to increase cover crops, collect more accurate data about soil erosion, cover crops, and other practices that can protect that, and then provide funds to the University of Minnesota's Office of Soil Health, which all of those activities will have a climate co-benefit, regardless of whether those provisions were adopted for climate purposes. And then additionally, the Department of Agriculture received $4 million for grants to the University of Minnesota's Forever Green initiative to, again, look for mechanisms to increase the economic viability and sustainability of farms in Minnesota and incorporate the perennial and winter annual crops into our existing cropping practices in Minnesota. Continuing on the natural and working lands, there was $7.7 million were identified for accelerated forest planting, forest measurement, and then also addressing emerald ash borer with a particular inclusion of replanting or replacing trees that we're going to lose to the emerald ash borer. So within that was $2.5 million to the Department of Natural Resources that should allow us to plant 12 million trees by 2025 and also expand the tree growing capacity at our state forest nursery. The Department of Natural Resources also received $1 million for the biennium to increase the accuracy of our forest assessment, our forest inventory, so that we better understand the health of our forest and the forest's ability to store carbon. Then $3.5 million is coming to the Department of Natural Resources for grants and other work around an emerald ash borer response, with a particular focus on looking to plant a diversity of trees, providing cities with the opportunity to plant those trees and then engage citizens in the forest activities as we respond to replacing and addressing emerald ash borer. And then $700,000 went to the University of Minnesota, again, for emerald ash borer work. And I'm including it in the climate related. And I want to emphasize all of these really fall under climate related, because we see that addressing emerald ash borer is climate related, because we need to be able to study how we're going to replace these trees and make sure we don't lose all of that carbon that's currently stored on our landscape. And then the final 2 policy additions that the Department of Natural Resources received was a directive to establish goals for increasing carbon sequestration in our public and private forests, including the identification of sustainable forest strategies, and then also a passage of a Sustainable Forest Incentives Act to promote those sustainable forest resource managements in our forested lands within Minnesota. Jumping to resiliency and adaptation, there were 3 primary items funded in this legislative session, and that was just under $2 million to the Pollution Control Agency to help cities, local governments, counties, and tribal governments assess their vulnerabilities and develop plans to enhance their stormwater infrastructure to respond to the extreme precipitation events that we expect to happen and are seeing happening because of the changing climate that's already built into our system. The University of Minnesota received $563,000 to do a weather projections for the entire state that can be used for planning for agricultural purposes, for city infrastructure purposes, state infrastructure purposes, and the ability to understand how a changing climate will require us to have different ways of managing the public services that we provide to the residents of Minnesota. And then there was $2 million that went to the Board of Water and Soil Resources for a pilot program to look to address uncontrolled and unmanaged agricultural drainage that protects both water quality, but also helps us with soil health and the climate benefits that come with improved soil health. Moving to transportation, this is where a significant amount of the funding lies, and that includes over $156 million to the Metropolitan Council. That includes expansion of bus rapid transit, conducting transit studies throughout the metro area and along Highway 55 corridors, and then also funding to allow them to conduct studies to include zero emission and electric transit options for their operations within the metropolitan counties. The Department of Transportation received an aggregate of $21 million to look at expanding bicycling and walking opportunities in greater Minnesota, to help with the infrastructure and other work on supporting a second daily Amtrak route to Chicago, and then looking for safe routes to schools, safe non-motorized ways for children to get to school. So we were lumping those again in the emphasis of climate-related work that we see happening with this legislative session. And then MnDOT also received $6.4 million for their rail service improvement programs, with primarily looking for how can we expand and leverage the reduced emissions that having improved freight rail service has over moving those types of freight with heavy-duty diesel trucks. Continuing in transportation, the Department of Agriculture also received some funding that falls under the transportation category, with $6 million in grants for service stations to upgrade their equipment so that they can be compatible with E15. So we have the cleanest liquid transportation fuels possible for the vehicles on the road. And then they also received $9 million to provide incentives for advanced biofuels work, renewable chemicals work, and biomass thermal energy work in Minnesota. And then finally, the Clean Cars Minnesota Rule Authority for the Pollution Control Agency was maintained, and then we did adopt that rule on Monday, July 26th. Now moving into clean energy, we have a number of provisions here, starting off with the Energy Conservation and Optimization Act, which updated our energy efficiency programs and really is instrumental to allowing us to achieve significant emission reductions by reducing the amount of electricity that needs to be generated in Minnesota and providing particular benefits to low-income Minnesotans and increasing the energy efficiency of all of our buildings. Then there was just under $18.5 million provided for solar on schools and community colleges throughout the state of Minnesota, and that will allow us to provide electricity to those schools and those community colleges, and then they can reap the benefits of the reduced electricity costs that they would face by generating their own electricity on their solar panels. The Department of Employment and Economic Development received $2.5 million to establish a clean energy jobs training center in North Minneapolis. And then there was legislation that also established an energy transition office, an energy transition advisory council, and the requirement for an energy transition plan. And that's focusing on ensuring that Minnesota is helping the host communities for fossil fuel power generation, those communities transition away as some of those close, especially our coal-fired power plants, and addressing their tax base and their jobs and economic development base that they have for their communities. And then the Department of Administration received $5 million for a revolving loan fund so that we can improve the energy conservation measures at state-owned buildings that we use every day. And then for other policy items that were adopted, the Natural Gas Innovation Act was passed, and this is seeking to provide more renewable natural gas onto the system, and also the opportunities for blending of hydrogen and green hydrogen into the system. And the Department of Commerce and the Public Utilities Commission will be working on that. The Public Utilities Commission just opened their docket on this issue earlier today. So if you're interested in that, we can provide you with links and more information there. And then there were research funding that was happening. Before I jump to that, I missed my next point, but it's the $10 million was authorized for an extension of Xcel Energy Solar Rewards Program through 2024. So for the years 2023 and 2024, there's an additional $10 million authorized. And then research monies were going to the University of Minnesota Morris, $10 million for their green hydrogen and green ammonia renewable power generation project. $5 million going to the University of St. Thomas for their microgrid research and development project, and then $100,000 going to Minnesota Management and Budget to work with the Pollution Control Agency on piloting our ability to put solar panels on our closed landfills in Minnesota, starting with a closed landfill in Anoka County. So that is everything that I have included in my PowerPoint presentation. I'll turn over to Kevin to see if he would like to add any comments about his experience with the hearings and other events at the legislature this year.
I appreciate that, Frank, and we were very involved. And first, just to start, to echo, people who know better than me said, for example, this is the biggest session since 2007 for energy, by a long shot. A really successful session, and kind of remarkable that it was done in the only divided legislature in the country. I think that's a huge accomplishment, and a bipartisan accomplishment. I think different folks contributed different things, but it's really important to recognize that. So our organization, representing construction workers, we had staff and members testify, provided letters of support, and lobbied for the 100% clean energy bill, Natural Gas Innovation Act, ECO, Buy Clean Study. We were part of the conversations around the Energy Transition Office and other provisions. And I think just in terms of a strategy here, like how it's worth thinking about how we got this much done, right? In a place, in a session where there's so much division and so much partisan polarization, around climate and a whole range of other issues. And I think there were a couple of takeaways that are important. I think if you look at what was successful, things like ECO and Natural Gas Innovation Act, which were major new pieces of policy that were done. There was broad and respectful stakeholder engagement over years. There was a lot of work seeking win-win solutions and a willingness to make compromise that I think were critically important to those getting over the finish line. So in ECO, you had something that, for example, the co-ops were excited as advocates about, similar with Natural Gas Innovation Act. We've heard, I think both among climate advocates saying every state should have this bill, and utilities, gas utility analysts saying every state should have this bill. And that's a remarkable accomplishment. And, I think if there's a silver lining in trying to work within a divided legislature, which is difficult, it is that it forces us to think much harder about the policies we're moving, what their impacts are, how to explain them in a way that people can see potential benefit, and where they could be a model for the rest of the country, because they were written in a way that addressed diverse stakeholder concerns, not just sort of like from one lens that works in one set of states and is anathema in another set of states. And I think those were really important. And I think it's also, look, obviously in a divided legislature, we made more progress toward efforts to facilitate and incentivize and streamline the things we want to do to remove barriers. And a lot of what ECO did, a lot of what Natural Gas Innovation Act did, was removing barriers and saying the commission can authorize, under these conditions, these pilots to test out innovation, right? That the utilities can do more innovative things in terms of their efficiency work, rather than, more so than sort of like new goals or raising goals. And I understand the desire to raise goals, but working on the ground, we have difficulty sometimes getting to everyone's current goals, right? Co-ops and electric utilities are faced challenges meeting their own internal goals, let alone anything the state might impose. And so I think there's so much work to be done in this alignment, and that's potentially bipartisan work that's been effective. And so I thought that was really good, and a reminder, we can't halt climate change from Minnesota. we have to, the best we can do, and we can't even bend the curve just in Minnesota. The best we can do is create a model that is adaptable and that is attractive to other states like us that might be on the fence, that might be not quite there or not have found a path forward. And I think with these bills, we started on that, and I hope that we can continue that progress. I mean, the polarization, I will say, though, that, yeah, it was a rough session from many perspectives. And even for us, leaning pretty hard into climate, it gets tiring, right? It gets tiring sort of like, the level of polarization on both sides, right? That we're facing, I think from both folks who are skeptical about climate action and for the folks who are insisting on it. The level of polarization is so great, it wears everybody down, right? And I think it creates a lot more conflict than is necessary. And I think we need to think more if we're wondering why everybody's not on board. I think sometimes if we're looking at who the messengers are, right, sometimes the messengers on climate are the same people that are the messengers on other issues. So, not to pick on anyone, but if the folks opposing mining are the leading voices on climate in northern Minnesota, there's a lot of folks who are just tuning out right there. And I think that we got to think about who are the right messengers, what's the message in a process to bring people on board, and probably bringing them on board saying, and I think in our interviews we're experiencing this, you don't have to get on board for climate, right? You don't have to make climate your top priority to support efficiency. And we shouldn't force people to do that, right? We shouldn't create a thing where everyone has to pick which side they're on. It's either climate over everything or do nothing, right? There should be lots of room in between to say, well, we probably need to do something about climate, but I'm most interested in saving money. And that, we should look for those other objectives that people can have and figure out how that all knits together. I mean, that was our experience. I mean, we felt like it was a really good session and much better than expected. And a lot of credit to the administration and the legislative leaders in both parties who managed to figure out this, despite the polarization.
Thank you, Kevin. Really, really well said. So we have a couple minutes for questions and discussion on Frank's overview or Kevin's perspective or anything else around what did and didn't happen at the legislature this session. So we have Alex first.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that great presentation. So I have one or two broad questions and then some specific ones. So the broad one is, how are you going to communicate to the public exactly what was accomplished during the session and how these new policies are going to benefit different sectors? So let me just give you one example. I've read some press about how some of the new legislation is really good for like using electric heat pumps and promoting electric heat pumps in outstate Minnesota. But even though I actually, part of my job is following all this legislation and what's happening, I don't have a good sense. Is that part of the Natural Gas Innovation Act? Is that part of ECO? And so if I'm having trouble with it, the people who really need to be taking advantage of this and should be taking advantage of this also probably aren't following what's happening. So, how can you translate the success into making, your average person understand how they should make investments, what they can do differently, where there might be money available for these climate-friendly policies to really benefit them. So that's kind of one question. And then much more specific is on the, I think there was talk about additional funding for new E15 infrastructure and just sort of infrastructure for service stations. And so I'm wondering, was there any money, is there any money that can be funded towards service station, electric charging stations? So having electric vehicle charging infrastructure in service stations and helping out some of the service stations on electrification in addition to ethanol. And then last specific question deals with, I think it was the $21 million for expanding walking and biking opportunities through MnDOT, and is that money that's going to flow to local governments to enhance bike lanes, walking paths, those sorts of things, or is this more of a statewide program? Basically, how's that money going to get used, and who are going to be the decision makers in that? Sorry for all the questions.
Great. Thanks for the question, Alexandra. As far as the first one, that's what we're working on right now. And my presentation is sort of our continued evolution. We're working on a fact sheet that can be shared with people at least at some level of detail. And that's actually the biggest challenge, is that we have such a bounty of provisions to talk about how to make it digestible. But I think what you lay out is something that we can follow up with within the senior leaders on the sub cabinet, is coming up with something that is layered, where we've got a high level description, but then starting to work with our agencies to get some more of the specifics and really focus on that piece of making it understandable. I think that is critical and key to try to translate what comes out of the legislative session, what these programs really mean and will look like on the ground will be a challenge for us. But I think we'll work on that and take that comment to heart, that's really going to be necessary and helpful. And I think to Kevin's point of trying to make sure that other messengers have correct information that they can also carry, and it's not just the state agency programs that are carrying that, but others can talk about these competently as well, especially with the breadth of programs that were adopted. I think that I was just looking down the list to see if Tim Sexton was available for the question on the active transportation management work.
Yeah, hi, Frank. This is Tim Sexton with the Minnesota Department of Transportation. Yeah, so the question about where that money is going to flow, it's going to be a mixture of support for local communities, especially with the Safe Routes to School funding. And then the active transportation program, that's a program that's been around for a number of years. This is the first year that it's been funded by the legislature. And so I think there's still some work to be done in terms of how that money exactly is going to be spent. But we do have a new statewide pedestrian plan that I think is going to guide a lot of that funding. But it really will be for local communities. I think what needs to be determined is exactly if that'll be through grants or support for roadways that go through local communities. Many of our trunk highways are actually function as main streets as well. So there's a little bit, I think, still to be determined by that, but that funding will be supported through an advisory council of sorts that includes both state agencies and external stakeholders.
And then to your final question, Alex, on the E15 funding, I think we'd have to look at the specific language of the grant, but right now I think that it would have a limitation to E15. But I think your point of hearing from those kinds of stakeholders of how to include EV infrastructure, if that's what there is of interest and a need to expand that, especially for those retail providers that are interested in providing access to the cleanest biofuels and access to EV charging, as far as how we continue to work on this area, because even $6 million sounds like a lot. This is one where we describe it as the problem is a mountain, and we probably just went to our local outfitting station and bought our gear to start climbing up that mountain. It will take us a while to be able to get there and be able to meet all of the need that exists out there. But and we can take that your comment to mind about how do we potentially look for including EV infrastructure for those groups.
Frank, do you mind if I jump in quickly? This is Commissioner Arnold. So Alex, to one of your questions, the ECO Act is the one that I think you were referencing with air source heat pumps. And there were a variety of proposals in the House that used RDA money or RDF money, depending on, I think, which generation of working on that you originated from, but those were not ultimately enacted. And so, those were sort of things that fell by the wayside in the long list of things that were in the House. So, and I think to your comment about, how will people know? I think, especially on the ECO Act, as we're kind of rolling things out, I don't think people will particularly care whether that's the ECO Act or the NGIA, although this group very much would. But we'll start to see as like the benefits accrue, then, when ECO is sort of in place, then we'll end the various provisions, then we will be able to talk about, okay, here are the benefits that you as a consumer can get because this program has modified. So it'll be sort of an evolving thing over the year.
Other questions or feedback? Any other just reflections or thinking around the legislative session?
Mariah, this is
Go ahead.
John Jaski. I was just going to say, one of the things, Frank alluded to it, but, sometimes how we talked about things, of course, made a difference in the political system that we ended up working in, right? And we ended up getting some things done that were described slightly differently just to get them done, so to speak. And I wish it weren't that way, but, that's the way I guess it is to get things done. Sometimes you got to be accommodating. So I'm sure some others had that same experience. So the way that Frank was able to, sort of tabulate this, I think was helpful because you may not see it written the same way in the appropriation language or even some of the policies.
And I will just add to Alex's point, as we develop that information, we'll be sure to share it with you as advisory council members, so you have access to the information and can use that in your connections and your discussions as you see useful and see meaningful for your work playing a role as an advisory council member. But with a lot there, we'll continue to delve into this and try to make sure that it's also understandable to most Minnesotans and not just understandable to us in the policy world.
Any other reflections or questions before we move on? And certainly, if anyone thinks of something later on, again, just jump in, chat. But I will move on to our next agenda item, and that is an update on what's happening around climate at the federal level. And for that, we have the Assistant Commissioner, Catherine Blauvelt from the Department of Commerce. Frank, do you know if Catherine is with us? No.
I am looking through the list. I
don't see Catherine. Well, we had a request to move an item up anyway, so we'll move on to our next item and we'll circle back to that piece. Amanda and Faith, are you both ready?
Absolutely.
You both are. So we're gonna move on to hearing about the climate action framework development and have some discussion with the advisory council about your role in that piece of work. So Amanda and Faith.
All right, thank you all for having us. Just gonna set up our PowerPoint here. All right, thank you for having us. My name is Amanda Jarrett Smith. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Climate and Energy Policy Planner at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and have been coordinating much of the climate action framework development work. And I'll hand it over to Faith here.
My name is Faith Krogstad. I'm the Engagement and Communications Director at the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board. And I use she, her pronouns, and I've been working very closely with Amanda on the framework and other aspects of the work. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Today we will cover what is the Climate Action Framework, how is it organized, and what is the timeline for its release, how we plan to engage the public on the framework, and the opportunities for the Climate Advisory Council to advise and collaborate on this work. Next slide. So first, what is the Climate Action Framework? It is a draft document that has not yet been released to the public. There is a summary document, however, that you have received, and it is available at mn.gov/climate, and we'll say more about that in a little bit. The Climate Action Framework is meant to be a bold vision for climate action in Minnesota with broad strategies that are co-created with the public. We'd like it to be a tool for accountability so that we can track our progress and share that progress with the public. And also we'd like it to be a catalyst for action across all sectors, not just state government actions. The Climate Change Subcabinet is drafting this framework in response to the Climate Change Executive Order, which tasked the subcabinet with policy and strategy development, as well as public engagement. The framework answers the question, what needs to be done on climate in Minnesota? It's meant to be a long-term document that is regularly informed by the public and revised. Next slide. Currently, the draft framework is organized into 5 sections, which loosely correlate to the subcabinet's action teams. And these are shorthanded here as transportation, natural and working lands, resilient communities, power and building, and health, equity, and jobs. And we are threading climate justice throughout all of these sections. Next slide. So I'd like to give you a snippet of content from the full draft framework so that you can get a sense of the document. And I've included a simplified version here, but each section has goals, areas of action, and strategies. So this example from transportation has an example goal of increase the percent of electric cars and light trucks on Minnesota roads to 20% by 2030. The areas of action are multimodal options, connected communities, electric vehicles, clean fuels, and vehicle efficiency. And then within each of those areas, we have strategies. So the strategies I've provided here: create an electric vehicle rebate program similar to other states and partner with businesses to electrify fleets. So as we develop this framework, we will be engaging the public to help determine whether we have the right goals, the right areas for action, the right strategies, and even the right organizing section at the very top. The framework, as you can imagine, is a very long document right now. Has a lot of contributors, a lot of detail, and it is constantly changing as we revise it. So it is being updated with information that we're gleaning from our engagement. Go ahead to the next slide. So because the full draft framework is really not ready for prime time and sort of hard to look at because it's pretty messy right now, the subcabinet created a summary document to use as we go about our engagement activities. The summary is short, it's about 7 pages long. It's easy to digest, and it's informed by past engagement. We really needed something that was concrete, but was clearly also not fully baked. We wanted it to be clear to Minnesotans that we are inviting them to contribute ideas to this and be part of that conversation. So I just want to quickly show you where you can find this document online. Amanda, if you could take us over to the mn.gov/climate site. There's a banner at the top, so go ahead and click on that banner. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, the PDF is down there. So this is a handy document that you can take, you can show people to give people a sense for what the subcabinet is, the direction the subcabinet is going with the framework. And it has those 5 sections that I described. If you want to scroll down to maybe page 3. There we go. So here's transportation. There's some narrative. We list out some possible goals, possible strategies. We want to make it clear, you know, nothing here is set in stone. We want your ideas. So this is a good tool for people to be using as we move forward. All right, let's go back to the slideshow. Thanks, Amanda. You can go to the next slide. So Amanda is going to share with you our current plans for engagement on the framework, but first I'd like to talk about why we are engaging. And it was interesting to hear the discussion around what happened at the legislature and kind of the challenges there, because I think that is very much alive in this work. We know that we will need an all hands on deck approach when it comes to climate action. And we also know that simply raising awareness and providing opportunities for public input will not be sufficient to drive action at the scale that we need. So we need Minnesotans to really be involved in creating our framework for climate action and to feel ownership over it. And for that reason, we plan to focus on relationship building, dialogue, and collaboration, so that Minnesotans really feel like this is, you know, our document, and we can drive that momentum. But through our engagement, we hope to elevate climate and climate justice as priorities in the state, uncover new ideas and improve existing ones. We know there are great ideas out there, We don't have a corner on the market when it comes to good ideas. So let's gather all those together. We want to find where there's energy, where is the momentum, and how can we harness that? We want to find out, who are people who could be leads and collaborators who can we partner with in this work. We want to build that shared understanding and address areas of, competing priorities or tensions, and find ways through those difficulties and challenges. And ultimately, we want to increase commitment and action as we go about developing this framework and implementing it. And I'm going to hand it off to Amanda to talk about the project ARC.
All right, thanks, Faith. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of the arc of the project and where we are, some next steps, and what we're doing right now. So this is kind of the general path that we're on. Each step is intended to gather input, have opportunities for Minnesotans to bring their ideas into the framework, and then build on each past step. So we're phasing that engagement and gathering of ideas and input. So this summer, we are using the summary that Faith shared to kick off conversations about priorities for the state that might be built into the framework. We're going to give that effort a boost during Climate Week, which is in late September, and then move into, continuing that into the fall with some additional tools that I'll talk about in a moment. And then in early 2022, we're going to be gathering all of that information that we've heard from folks over the fall and summer and releasing a draft of the framework. And so kind of distinguishing that from the summary is that it will be the full framework, but in draft form, and invite further input then, with a goal of releasing a final document of the framework in mid-2022. And then kind of thinking into the future, it's not just, release a document and let it sit there on everyone's desks, hopefully. The intent is to then move into implementation, progress reporting, and periodic updates of the document.
Amanda, can you
Yes.
share your screen again? Apparently there is some issue happening. If you could stop sharing and then reshare to try to correct that through Teams.
Okay. Can we see it again? Yep.
We see it. Thanks, Amanda.
Great. Okay, do I need to repeat this? So we have, not sure when it cut out.
It didn't cut out for us. It was a live streaming issue. So just making sure that folks who are following us can see, but you can just pick up right where you were. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for the clarification. All right. So kind of slotting into this path, what are the tools that we're using for engagement to hear from Minnesotans? So like I said, starting this summer, we're using that framework summary to have conversations. We're using an online tool called Engagement HQ that I'll highlight it a bit more in a moment. Our action teams are having meetings with stakeholders, tribes, potentially you all, and others who might be interested in weighing in on that summary document and those proposals. And then you all are having meetings with stakeholders, and I'd be interested in hearing from you how you think that those conversations might connect into this work potentially. Then this fall, we're going to continue using those tools that we started this summer. We're going to be adding a climate conversations toolkit that's going to encourage Minnesotans to talk about climate change and climate actions with their communities. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. And then we haven't developed our engagement plan for 2022, but again, it will be based on that full framework draft. So Engagement HQ is an online engagement tool. It's organized around the same framework categories that we talked about before. It's interactive so that people can see the state agencies' ideas that we've put forward in the summary document. They can add new ideas. They can react to the ideas that the state and others have provided. So I'm going to just share that with you all a little bit because I think that it's helpful to kind of see it in action before, in addition to just having someone describe it to you. So again, this is on our Minnesota Climate webpage. You can come in here and click on one of these categories. It has the same content that you find in the framework summary. And then you can scroll down, and this is where really the meat of the content is, or the tofu if you are vegan or vegetarian. And so it highlights the top, a few items here, but you can click into view all ideas. And here you'll find ideas both that the state agencies have put forward as part of that framework summary, and ideas that other people have put forward. You can interact with it. You can like things with this heart. You can provide comments. So this, for instance, has 7 likes on it, and someone has commented, and you can go in and see what that person has said. So it's a really great tool for us to share our ideas and kind of surface ideas from others. And we're really excited. This is one of the first times we've been using this tool, and we're excited to be using it with the climate work. And then again, this fall, we're going to be launching Climate Conversation Toolkit. So the state agencies are going to be providing materials for volunteer hosts to have conversations with people in their community. So maybe their neighbors or a faith group or people at their school. It's going to include some discussion questions and resources for them to think about climate change impacts on them, on their community, and on their future, and how they can act and how they can support broader action to address climate change. There are kind of 2 key goals that we're hoping to get out of these conversations related to those engagement purposes that Faith outlined before. We're hoping that the climate conversations will help build a sense of community around shared identity as people who care about climate change, know about it, can talk about it with others, and can do something about it. And then ultimately, that sense of shared identity, community, connection to this issue is kind of a building block towards action. So both for the people in the conversation and to spur it as a priority for them in their community and in our state. So this is a concept that we're still really developing, and we'll be able to share more details as it comes into more concrete life with the work groups over the coming weeks and months. And so we're really interested in hearing from you. If you think you might want to participate and connect with this work, we've identified some ideas here. We're also interested in if you all have additional or different ideas, either as an individual or as a group or a small group or a work group. There's kind of a lot of different iterations of how we could connect on this work. So thinking about both in kind of an advisory role and also in a more collaborative role on the actual engagement tools that we're rolling out. So we'd really welcome advice on the overall arc of the work and our engagement strategies. If you're interested in digging into the details on the framework proposals, we can set up meetings either with you individually or with work groups or some subgroup with the action teams and the senior leaders of the state agencies who are leading those action teams. Also, if you wanted to dig into the input that we're gathering and help identify priorities and common ground, we'd be interested in thinking about ways to do that as we continue to get input on our proposals. And then in terms of kind of collaborating on the actual items that we're producing and the engagement that we're doing, boosting that call to action signal during the September Climate Week, hosting or participating in climate conversations. One idea could be to have, for instance, a climate conversation with some of you all that's kind of a fishbowl so that the public can see how the climate conversations work and kind of hear your thoughts and kind of model that way. Or personally recruiting climate conversation hosts from your networks is another potential opportunity. We don't think that a lot of people are going to volunteer to be a host just from getting an email. So the state agencies are going to be doing outreach to individuals to ask them to host a conversation. And that's another thing that you could potentially assist with your connecting with your networks. And so now I'd kind of like to move us into conversation. If you have any input or advice on the project arc and the engagement plans that we laid out, if you have any ideas that from that previous slide that are resonating with you, that you're excited about diving into, and if you have any other ideas about how you might want to connect with this work, we'd be excited to hear them. So I'm going to close my screen share so that we can look at each other.
Alex, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thanks for the presentation. I guess just for the record, I'm happy to engage with any of the action teams dealing with electricity and transportation, just because those are the areas that I know best and would, love to work with folks. A couple questions on stakeholder engagement. So to get even to the point that you've arrived at in terms of your summary, has that been all internal to the agencies, or has there been stakeholder engagement to help even get to those initial goals? And I guess the reason that I ask is, like, looking at some of the transportation goals. I mean, having 20% of the cars on the road in 2030 be electric is a pretty ambitious goal, considering where we are now and the fact that people don't buy new cars all that often. So that's a big turnover. So in order to get to that, I would think you would want to have engaged with the auto dealers, the service stations, the sort of private sector where you're going to have that charging infrastructure and how those cars are going to be bought. And if you haven't, is that the next step that you're planning on engaging with those folks? Just because, frankly, in the stakeholder interviews that we've had in our working groups already, I think it's all people like to feel heard before there's a goal set that's going to directly impact them or they need to be a part of. So I think you just maybe want to be careful with that. Point two is I'm wondering how much you've engaged with other states that may be further ahead on some of these, because certainly on vehicle electrification, it's not just California, but places like Nevada, Colorado that have legislation on this. And also East Coast states. So are there models that you're trying to look at, both in terms of like customer rebates for electric vehicles and also for charging station infrastructure? And then last question is, how does the outreach you're planning to do this summer and fall intersect with the stakeholder interviews that many of us have done in the working groups already? Will it be in addition to that? How are you going to, I mean, this bleeds somewhat into our later conversation about what's happening with some of the stakeholder interviews that we've done. But I guess from your perspective, how do you envision what we're doing right now intersecting with the outreach that you plan to do later?
Yeah, great questions. And I'll, if others, Faith or Mariah, Frank, want to jump in and add here, that'd be great too. So a few things. So we did some engagement, the various action teams did engagement last year leading up to the most recent legislative session. So that's feeding into the framework. I would also say that, the state agencies have engaged over years about climate change on a variety of different topics. So, for instance, MnDOT and the Pollution Control Agency had the Pathways to Decarbonizing Transportation report that came out a few years ago that involved extensive engagement. We had CZO years before. And so one of the things that we've heard from some stakeholders is like, you guys have talked to us a lot. We want to see you kind of bringing these things together and reflecting back that you've heard from us already. So part of our thinking was not to start from square one, but to start from kind of an understanding that we've heard from people already on a lot of these topics, and what have we heard so far. So that's kind of where we're starting from in terms of engagement, and we are trying to put them forward as possible and proposed to invite that input. Like, are these things that do reflect what you've already told us or not? And how can we open that conversation? I think, it is a tricky balance to have both something for people to respond to and not just a completely blank page, because we hear a lot of times like, I don't know what you want me to tell you because you haven't showed me anything, versus like something that's too baked. So we're trying to kind of have some ingredients that people can respond to and think about and go from there. So I guess that's kind of our approach to the engagement in terms of where we are and having heard from people and continuing the conversation. In terms of looking at other states, I think that's really one of the key roles of the action teams is to be experts on a lot of these issues and to learn from other states, benchmarking and all of that in terms of their actual kind of policy expertise. And so there's a lot of different collaboratives that we have across the different state agencies that interact with other states and learn from them. And so that's kind of baked into what we're hoping that the action teams are doing in terms of coming up with their priorities that are coming into the framework. And then connecting to the outreach that you all are doing, the conversations that a lot of you are doing with this work, I think that's part of the conversation we want to have is how can we connect that into this work best? How do you want to bring that those conversations that you're having into this work, or do you want it to be somehow kind of a separate realm in some way? So I think that's part of the conversation we want to have here is like how can we work together and not duplicate efforts and really kind of build on each other. I don't know if anyone else from the team wants to add.
Yeah, I'll add to that. This is Frank Kolash with the PCA. On the working with other states, we are actively part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, and they have a specific group for the types of people like myself and Amanda who are working on implementing advisory councils or subcabinets or what those variations across the states. And it's really just getting started, but it's really very helpful to understand how they are approaching the work. We're also looking at their websites, looking at what they've done to see what we can replicate, what lessons can we learn, and we're starting to pursue some of those avenues. And then as a shared group through the Climate Alliance, we're also looking at how do we really address the fact that our history is not good on addressing equity in the climate sphere and in many of our policy spheres. How do we do that better? How do we reach those communities to make sure they're hearing their voice going forward? And that's a common struggle that all of the states are having. And then with other regional collaborations, there are a number of them at the national level. Some include the international level, but also Midwest region. And that is something that if you as an advisory council member would like to be connected with, we can talk to the organizers about that. Many of those do have outside of state government participants so that we are hearing the voices of the people, not just in state government, but who are in those businesses in that area. And if you are interested in that, please contact me and I will look for a group that may work for your area of expertise and interest to be able to contribute on behalf of the advisory council.
Thank you, Alex and Amanda and Frank. And we have a question from Ann Mulholland.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this report, Amanda and Faith. Great presentation. I really like the layout and the simplicity of it because I do think it's really, really consumable. So thanks for that. I do think there are opportunities, for example, for our committees that we created within this council to take different sections of this out to constituencies that we all have and get additional engagement and feedback, which I think will be helpful. The piece that, I'm very interested in this, however, is I love the layout and it leads me to craving more in terms of specificity of the possible strategies. So one of the things that we hear a lot about is how do we address climate change? What is the thing we need to do? And we don't need to do one thing. We need to do about 500 things, which requires a really bold agenda like this and a lot of clarity on what it looks like. So, I'm looking at the natural and working lands page, for example, where we talk about planting more trees and tree species. Great. Well, how many? Is it 1 million acres? Is it 2 million acres? Is that $1 billion investment? What does that mean in terms of investments this year, or next legislative year? I'm hungry for those real specific things because the truth is what this plan calls for is massive investment massive prioritization of these climate strategies, and policy changes that are really bold. That's what this really calls for. And I'm craving that level of detail and timeline and numbers on what it's going to take, because that's what I think is going to move the needle to get folks to lift up their head and say, oh, this is all of these things. It's all of this money, and it's now. It's not 10 years from now we can get to this. Because if we don't start planting these trees next year, then, you know, they're not going to have the carbon benefits that we need. So again, love this approach. Anxious and ready to move forward with a lot more specificity. So really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
We have another question from Marco Hernandez.
Hello. Thank you so much, Faith and Amanda, and also all the staff who worked on the draft. I just have two sort of suggestions of, well, one question and another suggestion. One being, when it comes to like the toolkit and also either the draft and the final draft for this report, will it be translated into other major languages for Minnesota, like Somali, Spanish, Hmong, etc., so that we're able to not only reach these communities, but make sure that we had a lot of our major immigrant communities participate, voice their concerns, and be reflected in this report. And then when it comes to my suggestion, for the last part, when it's promoting health equity and economic opportunity, I would like to see for the possible strategies combating green gentrification and preventing that as well. Because from a lot of these great things, such as providing more trails, bike trails, more tree canopies, etc., they have really good impacts, but sometimes, well, a lot of the times, the unfortunate result is we have folks that have been impacted negatively by environmental injustices moved out of these communities. And so that's my suggestion.
Thank you for that, Marco. And I two just kind of initial responses. I think one, on the translation, it's definitely on our list that we need to translate, and then also think about how we're actually reaching those communities, because sometimes we translate things and put them on our website, and then, you know, no one knows that they're there because we haven't made the effort to connect with those communities. So any thoughts that you might want to share, you know, maybe through your work group or an offline about those efforts would be very appreciated. And then you know, the green gentrification similarly is something that I hear when I talk to communities a lot. That comes up a lot when we're talking about electric vehicle charging, when we're talking about parks, when we're talking about all of these things. So that's a really gnarly issue, and I would be really excited to have more conversations with you about that. And with that, I actually apologize, but I have to jump off and give the same presentation to our tribal colleagues. So it's been so nice. And if this conversation goes on, I'm sure my colleagues here will share some notes. But thank you all for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. And good timing, because we have Governor Tim Walz here with us. So Commissioner Tester is going to introduce the governor, and we'll pick up this conversation after we get some time with the governor. Commissioner Tester.
Thanks. Governor Walz, hopefully you're on. We want to make sure we thank you for your support of this advisory group, for convening it and wanting it part of your executive order on climate change. Thank you for the incredible support you gave to the climate work that was part of this legislative session. And just so you know, we just heard of a summary of really some of the incredible efforts that were made across all parts of the state, all parts of the state agency. And we also thank you for the great climate events we have had this week and more to come. The Clean Cars event on Monday, the Eco Legislative Experience yesterday are all great sort of motivators to keep us moving forward in this. So thank you for that. I also want to let you know that I also spoke about Commissioner Bishop's resignation, but also her great commitment to this area and how important her work has been. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you. Thank you for coming and joining us.
Well, thanks, Peter. grateful. It's good to see all of you. See a lot of old friends on here and some new faces. First and foremost, incredibly grateful for you all being on here and the work that you're doing. An acknowledgement that the last year has been difficult, but we need to multitask, especially around issues that we care deeply about: climate, job creation, making sure that we're transitioning, but at the same time we're transitioning, we're making sure that equity is centered in around how we're delivering power, how we're generating power. When we think about transforming the transportation system, are we leaving anyone behind? How is that going to work? And I just want to acknowledge again that we spread as much bandwidth as we could over the last years. I'm incredibly proud of the legislative session, the things that we got done. That was many of you working many years. The clean cars piece that went through, the eco legislation, especially yesterday. It was incredibly gratifying to me to see our utilities, our rural electrics, our municipals, our utilities there standing right alongside climate action folks who've done this for a long time, standing right next to electricians concerned about good union jobs. And when we get good policy around energy, around the climate, we start to see that we can build some really interesting coalitions. And I just want to acknowledge, we came in with climate being a concern because I think the days of debating whether we need to deal with climate or not are long gone. And then trying to find ways where we find those intersections that work for everyone if possible. And just so all of you know, leaning towards and looking at your work, this is a group of people that can bring constituency groups that I can't reach alone, that each one of us probably can't alone. And when we see the only way to get some serious work done is to do that. It felt great to stand there yesterday against with that diversified group, and even inside the bipartisan nature of the legislation that went through. Now, certainly, I wish that could have been true around clean cars. For whatever reason, that became a litmus test. I think the good news is that that is one that will work itself out, because I think it will deliver on those promises that we talk about, whether it is creating jobs, whether it's saving money, whether it's bringing equity to the transportation system, and carbon reduction at the same time. So I'm just really grateful. I'm interested to see, as you start talking climate action framework, where you're going to come up with. I would just acknowledge to all of you an area that I worked a lot on in Congress and am very interested in was in soil health, and some of those, and that was a very bipartisan issue of how we viewed, carbon sequestration and other things that are now. I got a call from former Iowa Governor Branstad, who's very interested now. He's in private sector and he's doing carbon sequestration work and around farm country or whatever. So there's golden opportunities here. We don't all have to approach this from the exact same perspective, but when we bring all those multiple perspectives, what I think you can come out of this is help me build the coalitions and the framework necessary. And then my skill set, my commissioners who are on here, our job is to figure out how, one, we can usher it through and build that support to put these things either into statute or through rulemaking, and then to execute in a way where we're true partners with you. So I'm very excited about the potential that can happen there. I also do want to note, these fights are costly. They're costly in a lot of ways, and I feel personally responsible when I ask people to join us in this fight. And in the case of Laura Bishop, somebody put a professional career on there. My pro tip of the day to be a decent human being: take the fight to the person who you're really mad at. And that was me in this case, not to the person who was simply carrying out and building a coalition to get some true results. And so I want to just say the amount of expertise that's on this call, the amount of time that you put towards this, please know that I think the level of seriousness and the level of desire to see the products you're putting together and then to put them into actions is high in our administration. And I don't want you to, and again, we need to find all the bandwidth we can. We continue to engage on the issues we cared about during COVID, during some of the social unrest issues, and a lot of them intersect. There's a lot of intersectionality, and especially around climate and things. So I'm really interested to see what you're going to produce. Our team is really interested. It needs to be a working document. It needs to be one where you're feeling that input is being translated into action that works for, yes, the constituency or the position which you came to this council with, but as the council together. This is going to give folks, I think, these last couple of days have been very uplifting and optimistic in a time where it's hard to find some of that. I think you possess the ability to do a lot more of that. And whether we have 16 months or longer to do this makes no difference to me, because the framework and the roadmap needs to be kicked into place. I am grateful that those who came before me, dating back many years, and to the Paulini administration and others who started setting some of these waypoints for us. It's my responsibility to try and figure out if we can keep moving down that path the best way possible. I can't do it alone. I need you, and what comes out of this conversation today is one I'm really looking forward to. So, Commissioner, I'll turn it back to you and see if there's any questions.
Sure, Mariah, do you want to sort of moderate if there are any Q&A from the team?
Sure, Commissioner Arnold would be glad to answer them if there are. So,
All right. And we have a number of other commissioners here as well. So we'd love to hear questions, reflections from advisory council members for the governor, and we will start with Anne Mulholland.
Governor, thanks so much for joining us, and really appreciate your prioritization of this work. Can't thank you enough, both in terms of the sub-cabinet and the advisory council. One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is the 2022 legislative session and the opportunity that I think really exists for a bold investment in climate. I think you started your comments well with, I don't think it's any longer a question about how severe climate change is. It's happening now. And at least my observation is that your commissioners have some pretty great preliminary bonding requests out there. And they're bold. And what happens a lot of times in this process, as you know, because of priorities, is we get down to the brass tacks about numbers and we lose some of those important big numbers for big investments. And I'm hoping that we can take 2022 and have a very large investment into climate. I mean, you've made extraordinary progress this year, extraordinary progress, and it's huge applause is warranted. And I think there's a real opportunity to build on that in 2022. And I'm just wondering what we can be doing to support your efforts and to support your agencies that are putting some pretty bold requests out there that we're real pleased with.
No, well, thank you, Ann. And I just want to name it publicly. I agree with you on this. And I don't think we have time to not think boldly. I will just say, I think there's some things you can do to help me on building these coalitions, but I am just going to name it too. I've got to do a better job of building the coalition with my Republican colleagues. We got close to this, and I try and avoid it at all costs. And I think you see that publicly. The situation with Commissioner Bishop brought some of that to a head. I think my Republican colleagues, especially in the Senate, are ready to give up that climate change isn't real. And we need to continue to make things like we did yesterday available, that the free market can work. I mean, clean cars is a capitalistic market-based approach to carbon reduction. And I just need to stop the monopolies that are shutting that down a little bit. So what I need is, whether it be pointers, whether it be connections, and again, I'm going to rededicate myself. I just can't complain and cheap talking points. They don't believe in climate change. Woe is me. We got to figure out a way to get it done. And we did on a couple of fronts. One, I had to push through and bowl through in clean cars, and it was costly. The other one was more celebratory, and we brought it in together. So help us with that. You have my commitment to figuring out ways to make the climate issue less controversial, less partisan. I'm going to need to have some mutual help from the other side on this, but I need to give some people some off ramps to come back in, I was going to say from the cold, but from the heat, of denial of climate change, step back into this and put some of these good ideas forward that I know that are still out there.
Thank you. And that's something that we've been spending time talking about, certainly. Next, we have Marco Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Governor, for coming out here today, and really appreciate the honor to share my perspective. And so one of my questions is, As an activist lobbyist working in law and environmental justice, I've had the opportunity to go to the Treaty People Gathering, connect with Honor the Earth and Winona LaDuke. And so I was with the ongoing drought in Minnesota, and I want to congratulate the DNR again for suspending some of the permits for surface water related permits for Line 3 construction. But I want to ask, what will it take for the administration, for the state to look that we need to not only to stop it, but to have a moratorium on the construction that Minnesota is seeing historical low rain and drought within the state. And also hearing the pleas from the White Earth Tribal Council, Winona LaDuke, and others from Honor the Earth and indigenous tribes from across the state on how this impacts indigenous sovereignty and also wild rice waterbeds too. And so just wanted to hear your perspective and to see if there's any movement on a moratorium on a construction from Line 3.
Well, first and foremost, thank you, Marco, for this question. And first and foremost, what you need to get out of every administration is there needs to be clarity around it that, yes, we're following the science, yes, we're following the law, and yes, we're following the process, how these things are done. And administration's responsibility from each of these agencies is to follow things in law. There are permitting regulations that are in place. If those are not followed, they can be challenged in court, and then the courts will be upheld as they see fit. The thing that I think in the midst of this is we need to be very, very careful. I do not possess the legal authority to stop the construction of any project or any permit. I have the ability to direct agencies to follow that process and follow the law, both letter and spirit of that. As far as tribal consultations, we have codified those into law in this last legislative session. We have made the outreach of sovereignty a priority that probably, I think I can safely say, Minnesota is doing this as well as any state in the union. Is there more work to be done? Absolutely. And tribal consultation does not mean we're going to agree on every issue, but it means that the sovereignty needs to be met. This issue is going to be incredibly controversial as it's been from the beginning. My assurances from my team is that we follow all of those processes and we respect where the courts come in. But I will just say with this, I make it very clear, I don't find much pleasure in building new fossil fuel infrastructure, but I also recognize that if there is a demand, the supply will move. That is just the nature of the way economics work. I am working as hard as I possibly can to reduce the demand on fossil fuels, and that's where we're putting our efforts. So I'll continue to follow that. As we're challenged in court, we will follow what those courts say. But as of this time, we are simply following what the process and the law shows we should do.
We have time for just one more question or comment for the governor, and that'll come from Chris Clark.
Well, Governor, great to see you. Congratulations on your ECO event signing yesterday. Sorry I couldn't be there, but I want to say that really enjoy working with many of the commissioners in your cabinet and really enjoyed working with Laura Bishop when she was a commissioner in your cabinet. One of the first things she did was meet with us to get our ideas about how we could address climate change. So really appreciate that start, and we look forward to working with her with whatever she does next. I wanted to just pass along, we've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of different stakeholders as part of our work here. And one of the things that has struck me, some of the folks that I thought we were going to talk to who were going to have a lot of comments opposing what we were doing have actually been very quick to say how much they want to help. And that's been really encouraging. They've also had a lot of practical issues that they've brought to the table, and they want to make sure they're being heard on those. They ask us to listen and make sure we're considering those. And then they've asked for very practical tools like how can we put together a roadmap and a timeline for them. And I know Commissioner Anderson Kelleher is here, and no doubt people at MnDOT are good at putting together maps. So these seem like things that where we can come through and show constituents and stakeholders that we're listening. There's been excitement about opportunities to innovate and try new things in Minnesota. And I think those are great places for us to bring ideas and connect people together. So I think when you talk about coalition building, I think there are some really great opportunities to showcase what we can do throughout Minnesota, across all of our communities, to consider equity as we do it. And then finally, you know, I work for a company that makes big capital investments that bring a public benefit to them. And one of the places where Minnesota has been a leader in that is with our conservation and energy efficiency programs. With ECO, we'll take that to the next level. A lot of constituents are asking for that kind of help. And I know that there are places where the government is going to reach a limit where they can't do it all. But there, I think, are a lot of great opportunities for public-private partnerships, and not just with my company, but with all sorts of companies across the state. I've been really encouraged by how many small businesses, medium businesses, large businesses want to step up and try to be part of the solution. They're also, of course, dealing with coming out of COVID and with labor and supply chain issues. So the distractions are there, but they all say these are important issues that we appreciate being able to work on. I just wanted to share that with you and encourage, you know, this cooperation across your cabinet is really important to helping make sure that we get things done, and that, you know, when there are communication misses, that we're providing that feedback too. And, you know, we all have those misses, so it's good to get the feedback and know where we can improve. Wanted to just pass that along. And again, thank you for your leadership.
No, thanks, Chris. And I very much enjoyed working with you. I think the diversity of folks sitting on this council, and again, I hope you've got to see it. I know COVID pulled a lot of us, you know, in a different direction for the last 18 months. But surrounding myself with folks who are experts and listening to them, even though they don't, this is not about my ideology. It's about where the process can take us, what's possible, and what is absolutely necessary. And so I'm really grateful to hear that. I also want to just, you know, clarify as clearly as I can that this council and the importance and where we prioritize it is incredibly important to us. I don't want to believe that this is a checking of the box or that we're going to reject something because it wasn't our idea or we're not prepared to do it. We need to move. And this is some of the brightest minds and the broadest representation that we can find in the state. So I want to put that to use. And I'm really grateful of the comments around these commissioners. And I just want to make sure that I end with this, that talk about Laura a lot. That team over there is incredibly good. That's part of that. Peter Tester has my full support to do what he's doing. He is operating and moving things forward, the same professionalism. And I keep saying during this time that they asked, you know, about this job, you know, what is it? How did you learn? You know, what would you say about this during this time of COVID and unrest? I said, I think the most important traits for the job I'm in is be able to ask the right questions and then be surrounded by people who know how to answer them. And you are part of that. I can't hire every one of you, but I'm certainly using your sense of public service and servant leadership to draw upon. So challenge us, ask us. These commissioners take that same spirit into it, and we'll make progress. I'm proud of Minnesota. I said it was, the criticism was they used it as a critique on me when they said our clean cars bill was making us an outlier in the Midwest. I take that as a sense of pride. I want us to be an outlier around climate, job creation, reducing energy costs, and equity in this sector. So thank you for that. And Peter, I'm going to turn it back to you before I hop off.
Great. Thank you, Governor. And I know you'll find a really willing and ready group here to help communicate out to their constituencies. They've been great in that, and looking forward to even doing more of that with you over the next year. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Right. As the governor leaves, we're going to also take a break here. So we will be back at 2:45. Thanks, everyone. All right, we're gonna get started again if folks want to rejoin us. Hopefully folks got a little stretch or caffeine break or whatever gets you through 3 hours on Teams. All right, looks like a few people are just rejoining us. All right, so we've been covering a lot today, but Frank is going to jump in and give just a really quick update on what's going on at the federal level, just for context, and then we'll move into hearing about what's happening at the work group, and then Commissioner Anderson Kelleher will be here to kind of help us tie all of this together and talk about, given everything we've heard today, and your talents and skills and resources, how do we really take best advantage of the advisory council to move forward all of the work that we've been hearing about today. So Frank, you want to give us a quick update on the federal piece?
Sure. Thank you, Mariah. And again, for those of you on the phone, Frank Kolash, Climate Director with the Pollution Control Agency. And I think we will probably be providing more information as it becomes available via email. But what we're looking at right now are a couple of buckets of federal money potentially coming to Minnesota. Some are coming to Minnesota with the American Rescue Plan Act. And there is the opportunity to spend some of that money for under the federal guidance for like water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure. But we're also looking at all of the other needs that we came about under the COVID response and how that all fits in. And so there's a couple processes that are be working within the state. We have a process within the administration to look at the amount of money that we've been allocated to the governor and the administration to look to spend. And then at the legislature, they have been given certain pots of that ARPA funding, as we call it, to also look to spread out to Minnesota as we have COVID relief funds. But we're also working with other states, particularly looking at how Maine is leveraging some of their American Rescue Act funds for climate resiliency and climate work to see if that's something that can work. But we also know we have to balance those with other needs around the state on COVID response and COVID recovery. And then we're also tracking 2 infrastructure and jobs bills that are working their way through Congress right now. One is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Fund, or the BIF for the BIF. And it is a very large bill. And this is one where I'll try to go over some items, but there'll be no way I could go over these in any detail with less than 30 to 45 minutes on the size of the bill. But there's significant amounts of money for energy efficiency, for transmission, for some of the clean energy planning. We're hearing that, of course, Minnesota Senator Tina Smith is looking to get a clean energy standard in one of these infrastructure bills going forward. There's money for battery recovery and recycling programs, critical materials programs, electric transmission programs, protection of communities that have hosted fossil fuel facilities and their transition, protection for or incentives for nuclear power to keep those online for carbon-free status. Smart grid technology. They do include some methane work. On also watershed work and looking at the connection between climate and watershed, competitive grants for states on a number of energy issues, both energy development and clean energy, clean technology development, and as well as electric efficiency and energy efficiency work there. And also looking to have a fair amount of money to provide to states for grants on encouraging clean technology and clean energy development within the state. So these are passing through the committees at the Senate level. The Senate bill is up and available. We can provide that link if you'd like to look through it. Again, a large bill. What we are waiting for is to hear at the U.S. Senate how the House is going to deal with that, because there's another infrastructure bill that is being looked at, which would be through the congressional reconciliation process that would be brought together. And the initial word is that the U.S. House may want to try to move both of those together versus moving the bipartisan infrastructure bill forward separately. So we're waiting to see how those would go. And within the reconciliation bill, we are looking at how we can make recommendations and information available to our congressional delegation for areas that exist with programs that exist already that could be, if they were funded through this reconciliation process, could be conduits for states to have access to funding for climate related work. And that's again going to go over that list of energy efficiency, electric vehicle infrastructure, electric vehicle incentives, if that's possible, wastewater infrastructure, energy efficiency work. And then we're also tracking what's happening with the Farm Bill and the opportunities to work on the natural and working land solutions, carbon sequestration, soil health opportunities, and even the opportunities that the Department of Agriculture is looking at for a carbon market system that would apply, and how can Minnesota be on the leading edge of that work. So far too much to go over in any reasonable amount of time here, but we are actively tracking all of those infrastructure bills and working with our counterparts at the federal level within our agencies, the Pollution Control Agency working with Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Commerce working with the Department of Energy and the Energy Office there, to make sure that we're giving them the ideas and the signals that if they provide this kind of money to the states, we are going to take it and use it to the maximum amount that we can and is feasible to address climate related issues, as well as the other pressing issues that those funds are meant to approach. So again, looking for those co-benefits that can come about to address these issues going forward. So I'll stop there and try to answer any questions and invite anyone else who is involved with some of the infrastructure funding to help me provide the answers here.
I actually am hoping that we can move along, because we want to make sure that we spend a lot of time talking about where we go from here with the advisory council. So I'm hoping folks could chat questions on the federal climate work and budget, or follow up with Frank separately, so we don't spend too much time on updates. That said, Alex, since you raised your hand, is there something that you would like to touch on before we move on?
Yeah, just a quick comment that it might be, in light of that, it might be really helpful, to the extent that we do try to build out some concrete examples in the climate action framework summary, that some of those examples end up being tied to where we think we might be able to get money at the federal level, to the extent some of that money is competitive among the states, or just that we have some sort of a plan for implementation that money would go to. So I think it would help with quicker implementation, and would also make us more competitive in terms of being able to get those funds. So to the extent that we end up doing some specific examples, it'd be good to use some of the potential federal funding as a guide for developing those.
Great, thanks, Alex. All right, so I'm going to move us on to the next section of our agenda, where we're going to hear from each of the work groups at the Advisory Council on what you've been working on. So just for folks who are listening in, we have 3 work groups. We have natural and working lands, we have climate economic opportunities, and we have climate equity, health, and communities. And so each of the work groups are in different places in their work, and that's great. And we have a representative from each work group, and I'd like you to take just 5 minutes to give the rest of the group an update on what your process has been, any takeaways or learnings that you have, anything that you want to share with the other Advisory Council members, so that we all know what we're all doing in our respective groups, and that will inform our conversation about where we go from here. So I'm going to start with Ann Mulholland from the Natural and Working Lands Group. Oh no, I see Ann shaking her head.
Mike Birkland.
Mike, oh great. Okay, Mike.
All right, well, I'll make sure to include other members of our group though as well. So Ann, be ready. We've got folks from the ag sector. We've got folks from really the working land sector that are part of our subcommittee, and we've had probably 3 meetings thus far. Summer schedules have kind of inhibited our opportunities here as of late. We had some scheduling conflicts here in July, as I'm sure others have had as well. But so we're a small group, but I think we've kind of coalesced, or we've come together around the idea of a couple of key areas of focus. And one is on communication and spreading the message, and really kind of mapping out the message of really how our natural infrastructure, how our working lands, whether it be in the ag sector, the farming sector, or whether it be with forestry and forests, really does play a vital role in combating climate change, and it's a natural role. And Ann touched on it earlier with her question to the governor. And there are opportunities both on the communication side of things. So maybe there's some opportunities with the climate conversations that were covered earlier today that we can tie in with and tie into, but also on the policy front, as Ann outlined. And there are several ideas, that we're discussing. We're talking about bringing in others, in additional people, additional resources to help, especially experts in these particular areas of natural working lands and natural solutions, if you will, so that we can ultimately achieve multiple benefits. And by that, everything from healthy farms to healthy forests to healthy communities to a healthy climate. And really, it's a focus that has multiple. It has the idea of multiple benefits when we can spread that message and when we can incorporate policy solutions that don't focus on just one tunnelistic vision or one component of climate change in general. These are some real solutions, and healthy forests in the sector that I'm representing is vitally important, because if we don't have healthy forests, if we're not managing our forests for a variety of different values and benefits, then you sometimes create more challenges and more issues related to climate that similar to what we see out west right now. So that's just one example. And so again, it's kind of coalescing and coming together around the messages and mapping that out and really sharing within our stakeholder groups, but maybe tying into some of these broader efforts as well. It's really, the way I view it, it's more than just about reforestation. It's more than just about taking land out of egg production, but it's really kind of building all those benefits into the big box and sharing that out. So I guess I would turn it over to other members of our committee. We've got Ann, and Pat, I think, on the Zoom meeting here today from our group, if you want to add anything to that.
I guess I would just say that we can't forget all of the organizations that we have in the agricultural and forestry sector, and all the businesses that are involved I think they're getting ready and willing to really help in this whole effort. And we need to make sure that we pull everyone together and to actually include those segments, so that we're not trying to do this piecemeal. I think organized, we can do a really good job. And discussed earlier the need to really get moving on climate change. And I'm experiencing the most miserable summer drought-wise as a farmer since 1988. It kind of shows you that, hey, if you plant trees this year, they're not all going to live, through the drought. So we have to be ready to go. We have to be persistent every year, because it's going to be an uphill climb to actually fix our problems. And we, like I said, we have to be persistent at it and really have a major push. I'll stop there.
And we'll have time for discussion across all the groups after we hear from each group. But anybody else from Natural and Working Lands want to add any initial thoughts? And then we're going to move on to climate equity, health, and communities. And Micah Neerman is going to give us an update from that group.
Yeah, thanks. So there are 4 advisory committee members that are serving on that climate equity, health, and communities work group. So Khalif, Ann, Marco, and myself. We've met, the full committee's met 3 times, April, May, and again in June. This spring, we've actually been kind of moving at a thoughtful pace, given the trauma that many of the communities have been experiencing over the past 2 years. In fact, we spent some of our time in the first meeting reflecting on the tragic events that unfolded during the pandemic, especially regarding the killing of Daunte Wright on April 11th and the trial and sentencing of former police officer Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, and then how these injustices impact the work on health and equity within the context of climate change and how we reach out to communities. We also discussed that we needed more representation from different communities, how we can expand our networks, build relationships, and then how we make meaningful conversations with our communities throughout Minnesota. And so we had reached out to contacts that we had in the community in recruiting additional members. Some of the organizations include Great River Greening, Midwest Environmental Justice Network, Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy. And please, for the rest of my members of the work group, please jump in if I'm missing anybody or missing anything. And then we did spend some time getting just to know each other through conversations about the barriers to the work. So like that, and how we can develop strategies to overcome these barriers. So two specific ones, and I think these are some that have already kind of come out in themes through our conversations in this afternoon's meeting. That's really acknowledging the government isn't a trusted source within communities, and the fact that climate change is seen as a contentious issue. There's also a spectrum of disengagement from people in communities who just flat out deny climate change is happening, and then to others who may be concerned about climate change, but just have real immediate pressing issues and priorities that drown out the concerns for climate change. So we discussed some of the communication strategies to have more meaningful dialogue with these different communities, and how we can move the climate equity, moving forward, how we reframe the conversation, how we can use different terminology and connecting on shared values. So I think now we're at a really good place determining how we will engage with that strategy, and then now it's going to be reaching out with our networks and getting feedback from our contacts. And I think Anne's point earlier, what will be really helpful for this is being able to come to the communities too with a lot of specifics about how the changes that are being proposed will directly affect them. And that will also really be meaningful in shaping these conversations. So please, everybody else, please jump in.
Anyone else from the Climate Equity, Health, and Communities group want to share any initial thoughts? All right, then we'll move to the Climate Economic Opportunities group. So we have Alex Kloss.
Hey, everybody. So let's see. Our group consists of me, Chris, Hilda, Eric, Kevin, Wayne, and Dave. I don't think I forgot anyone. And we've been meeting for a while. We were meeting almost weekly, trying to figure out how we should move forward. We decided to go forward just with our group, not adding, additional people from the public, but to do a series of stakeholder interviews, which we've been doing on Microsoft Teams, and we divided up into subgroups. So I'll speak mostly about the interviews that I've been doing with Chris and Hilda, because they're on my team, and we have now spent many hours together on Microsoft Teams interviewing folks. And I think actually among our broader group, there has been a difference of opinion as to whether these, at least going into it, whether these stakeholder interviews are worthwhile. And I think part of that is not having a good sense of how any of that information would actually be used and be helpful by the state. I do think this conversation we've had over the last couple hours has been helpful in that regard. And I think that the information, we're getting really good information from these stakeholder interviews. I think Chris, when the governor was on the phone, Chris did a nice sort of overview of the types of things that we're hearing. And I do think to the extent we can integrate that into the feedback that you're hoping to get from the public and other stakeholders moving forward with the climate action framework, then I think it can be very useful. So just as an example, we've had 7 one-hour interviews so far, and I'll just say who the groups are, just so you have a sense of who we're talking to. And that's the Minnesota School Bus Operation Association, Minnesota Service Station and Convenience Store Association, Twin Ports Arrowhead, NECA, the electricians, the Minnesota Trucking Association, Drive Electric, which is a subgroup of the Great Plains Institute, and then the Minnesota Auto Dealers Association. And we've gotten a lot of really helpful information. I mean, most of these groups, including ones who we thought might be at least somewhat hostile to some of the administration's efforts to move forward, like on clean cars, are actually quite supportive of the idea of energy transition, climate change, how it's impacting them. These have not been controversial issues. Instead, what we're hearing is that they want to know more about the rollout, about the roadmap. How is this going to get implemented? how is it going to benefit them? What are the challenges going to be for them? I think they would like more engagement with the state agencies who are making that decision, making those decisions. They all seemed extremely grateful that we were reaching out to them and really engaged in the conversation. And several of them had said, hey, these are, obviously mostly trade associations, but both the service station association person and the auto dealers association said, we have members who applied for grants to put in charging infrastructure because this stuff is really expensive. And we need help with that. And we were denied, and we were never told why we were denied. And so, thus my comments earlier about, what can we do to sort of help money flow and economic opportunities flow to folks who may be skeptical about some of these efforts, but easily see why this is in the interests of Minnesota as a whole and even their own, business going forward. So I think we've learned that, and I think we can, I think this has been helpful. I think we have a bunch more to do, and I guess I'll stop there and just hopefully hear from Chris and Hilda things that I missed.
I just had one other group that we were able to talk to this morning, Bemidji Bus and the Motor Coach Association. So I think I saw Charlie Zelli on earlier, so I wanted him to know that we haven't forgot the bus industry. And they were full of ideas about how regional buses could actually help with reducing vehicle miles traveled and taking cars off the road. So it was interesting. Again, interesting, very practical thoughts that we heard from him.
Anyone else from the Economic Opportunities Group that wants to share any initial thoughts? All right, well then I'm just going to open it up. Thank you, Alex and Chris, for conversation across the work groups. Just a conversation amongst you all. What can you learn from each other that will help you in your work going forward? Challenges, opportunities, where do you see this work going? And invite sub-cabinet members to jump into with any feedback or questions you have, or it's advisory council members if you want to ask commissioners questions related to your work group work as well. So jump in.
So Mariah, I just wanted to add, we interviewed utility and a couple big contractors, and a lot of what they were saying is they were happy to hear that we're allowing them to be heard and listen to what they have to say. But they also wanted to make sure that anything that happens with regard to the climate change framework, if there's codes or regulations that need to be made, it needs to be reasonable. They have to kind of balance that against the cost of, for example, a net zero home. You gain most of your energy conservation with the first 80% of your costs, or the first 50%, and then if you want to meet that LEED certification level, you have to spend lots of money to do that, and you have to kind of weigh that in order to reach that level of certification. So that was a lot of their comments in regard to that, just kind of balancing cost benefit. So thanks.
Thanks, Wayne. And just jump in, folks. What are you thinking about? What are you wondering about?
Kevin here. Wayne did a good job summarizing some of the feedback we got. I think one of the key hopes for us is that the feedback we get will inform the climate action framework, because that's sort of what we're telling people is, look, you tell us things, this will be incorporated. If there's specific concerns, we'll try to address them and chase them down and come back to you if there's feedback that's relevant. Hopefully I'd like to be able to show people, here's where it's reflected either in the draft that already was, or in the draft, in ways that it's changed. I think to reflect that feedback would be really useful, because I would agree with everyone. These were very positive conversations, a lot of interest in working together, a lot of appreciation for the fact that we were reaching out. And when we asked, one of our survey questions is what can the state be doing? The first answer was exactly what you're doing right now, like having groups like this reach out and collect feedback and make sure that, there's follow-up.
Yeah, so just on that point, we absolutely want to incorporate the feedback into the framework. Unless there's any reason on the advisory council that that's of concern, or there's some group, that doesn't want that to be the case or whatever, that's absolutely our intention. So right now we have just a spreadsheet, and we can talk about other more sophisticated processes, but to capture that feedback, and then we'll be collecting that along with other conversations that are being held by the action teams or other places. And we're going to have waves of feedback, as you heard from Amanda earlier, as we have kind of waves of iteration and getting more and more specific on the framework. So absolutely yes, and you can tell folks that you're meeting with that the answer to that is yes. How we circle back to folks and let them know that their feedback is heard is always tricky. So we've given you all the tools of folks can sign up for delivery to get notices, and they can visit the climate page to see what activities are going on, and they can provide feedback through that engagement HQ. So those are just a couple tools. I know everyone loves to get a government listserv email, but part of our work together can be not only are you all sort of great messengers with great messages to go out initially and get this feedback, but also how can we work with you to circle back as well? I mean, we'll do things like keep lists of everybody that we talked about and document the changes that we've made, but it isn't such an easy thing to make it clear and get back to folks. So that's definitely a place that we could work together.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I was just saying the other piece of feedback that seems important that we got from several people is the idea of what the sort of resource trade-offs are. In other words, look, we can get to 80% in this area, but getting to 100%, entails a significant cost, right? To get from 80 to 100 is pretty hard in a lot of areas. And so the questions are, I think it would be good, and I remember early in climate, there's a lot of these sort of McKinsey presentations that just look at what's the relative cost of doing different pieces, because I think those are, whatever decisions we make on 100% clean electricity, et cetera, I think it would be good to have whatever sense we have the relative costs here, because, there's a lot of cases where it could be that 80 or 90% makes sense in one area, and that those resources should be redeployed somewhere else where there's cheaper, better gains to be had, if that makes sense. And that was a lot of feedback we got from stakeholders was, let's really try to think about what the costs and benefits are of different approaches in putting that together. And I think it would be helpful for the framework or somewhere in the process to sort of acknowledge, look, there's different ways you can get there. There's a bunch of ways you can get there, and we're trying to find what's the way that's best for Minnesota.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and lines up, I think, with everything we've been talking about today about how do we kind of get the most benefits out of this economic and equity and climate. And so as we're gathering all this input, I think that you all will have a really interesting and helpful role to play down the line when we look at all this feedback and weigh those kinds of issues of, where is a cost worth a benefit and where is it not, and how do we prioritize so that we build that strong consensus so that we get things implemented and not just come up with a list of things that are lovely but that we aren't able to move forward. So there are a couple.
Brian, if I can just add to that question of that relative costs and understanding the benefits, we are also working on with a tool that is specific to Minnesota that has been put together by Energy Innovation and working with the Rocky Mountain Institute to build that out. That does include both the projected emission reductions, but also some of the costs, the benefits, the job growth, the job loss. It has an economic impact side of it too. And we're hoping that that's going to be more ready for sharing and for prime time this fall. We have to work on them on some of the issues to make it specific to Minnesota and address Minnesota's unique place, especially in the natural and working lands area.
All right, we've got Hilda and then Eric.
Thank you, Mariah. I just want to add another thing that it was mentioned several times in our interviews, is that when we get to the specific, like I know right now we're discussing the strategies, goals, but we haven't reached the actions. But they said that when they got to the actions, they really want to be in the discussion, because they know the operational part of the things, like, with trucking and with the School Bus Association, they were really concerned about infrastructure, batteries. So I guess they know that the operational part, and they said that they will really love to be in the discussions when the time comes.
Yeah, one of our challenges will be to track all the good feedback, right? The general feedback and what are the follow-ups and where are there specific things for, one state agency to follow up on, or, if we want to get back to somebody about feedback on their grant application or something. So we'll keep working in our work groups to drill down into those specifics to make sure that we track and follow up on all the important points. All right, we've got Eric and then Alex.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering for the members of the sub-cabinet, what tool or tools is everyone using, and is there an agreed upon maybe source of truth when it comes to doing the math on the framework and making sure that this all adds up to what it needs to add up to? I kind of think about in Congress, you have the Congressional Budget Office that projects out, budget forecast, surpluses and debt. Where are we as advisory committee members and for the sub-cabinet, what are we looking to for that source of truth? Because we can already tell there's going to be people who want to, sort of negotiate down their piece of it and get more from somewhere else. But if it doesn't all add up to, if the math doesn't work, then we're kind of just kidding ourselves. What resource do you look to for that information to kind of hold all of us accountable?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eric. And we're looking primarily to that tool that Energy Innovation has put together and has been reviewed by a number of national labs and other organizations. And we're working with them to make it specific for Minnesota. They have a first draft that is specific for Minnesota, but what we found is that their incorporation of the natural and working lands strategies is just not representative of what can happen in Minnesota and what others have shown for the opportunities in a large agricultural state and forestry state in Minnesota. So we're looking to update that. And that within that tool, they have built out both for the nation where we're going, but they've also built out a list of strategies that could get us to the 30% reduction by 2025. And that is really aggressive, and it is really stark to see how much it will take to turn that curve downward to that degree. But that's the tool we're primarily relying upon to help us check on the magnitude and the directionality of these efforts to make sure that we're focusing on the ones that get us the most change in emissions. But then also that tool allows us to look at the economic benefits. We're also working within the U.S. Climate Alliance. They have engaged some groups at the national level, and they're looking at it more from an energy side about what it would look like if we electrify, or we clean up the electric generation sector and then we electrify into other sectors. And what is that going to bring both for the nation, for the Climate Alliance states, but then also for the individual Climate Alliance states. And we're just starting to get some of that information and look to see how does it inform these strategies that we're looking at. So we're kind of looking at it on a couple of fronts in that vein of no modeling is going to be correct, but we're looking for the modeling that will be useful to us to help us make the decisions and highlight which strategies we should prioritize because they're going to give us the largest impact for emissions, or they're going to provide us the largest benefit in innovation and economic development, or addressing equity, or addressing our natural and working lands.
Frank, could I just ask one quick follow-up question? In that modeling, are you looking at this entirely from emissions reduction, or are you modeling carbon capture? And I just ask because I think a lot of companies, as they're setting goals, are being overly optimistic about the potential of carbon capture technology, which is at least currently unproven and doesn't scale. And so I hope as we're modeling this out that we're not betting too much on carbon capture technologies to save us from not reducing emissions enough, and that we're really heavily emphasizing what we need to do to reduce emissions. And if technology comes through later, that's great, but we shouldn't count on it.
And that's one of the great dynamics of this tool is we're able to turn policies on and off. So the tool can have carbon sequestration or carbon capture as a technology that we can choose, but right now we haven't seen any real, credible projects or proposals coming forth in Minnesota. If they do, we can try to build those in different degrees. It allows us to play with that as a selector. But right now, since it's not been a major part of the policy discussions, we're not really turning that one on just yet as we look at this. Where we're really focusing our attention is the ability of our natural and working lands to be a place where we can store more carbon.
Great.
And
My
that model is
recommendation
now
would be to keep that turned off. Glad to hear it. Thanks.
Alex and then Kevin.
Another thing that we're hearing from stakeholders, at least the group that Chris and Hilda and I are speaking with, is that quite a few of them are very interested in providing an educational component for Climate Week as part of your Climate Week activities, that they could either provide information on what their industry is trying to do, what some of their goals are. And I think that would be helpful for you to hear, since presumably at Climate Week there'll be a lot of exchanges of ideas. But it also just that made, since they expressed that interest, I think it would also be an opportunity for people at the state agencies to engage with those stakeholders and hear from them even more directly about things that they might be interested in terms of infrastructure and funding and moving forward, and also just what their concerns are. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that that interest was expressed by almost everybody that we spoke with.
That's super exciting, because I think we're really interested in figuring out who wants to collaborate with us in various ways. So, putting on activities during Climate Week, doing presentations, joining us in activities. So we'll make sure that the forms that you'll have for tracking have all those categories so that we get all that information from you and are able to follow up. But I think that's one of our hopes is from these conversations, not only do we improve our policies, but we figure out all different kinds of ways to work with folks. So thank you for sharing that.
And Mariah, I should just add, I think Hilda forwarded to you the feedback forms that we've filled out to date, and feel free to share that with the broader group, and obviously with all the folks at the agencies, if you think that's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Since we're just getting them in, we figure out the best ways to track and share all that info, but for sure we'll be sharing it with everybody at the advisory council as well as the sub cabinet, just figuring out the logistics of making it really useful and digestible for folks. Kevin?
Well, I wanted to, I agree on that. We've heard feedback with Alex. We've heard feedback also from other parties interested in being part of Climate Week potentially. They really just wanted to know details like what exactly we're talking about. And so I think there are groups that would be interested, but there'd have to be some work either giving them details or working with them to figure out ways they could participate. And so I guess we should start doing that soon because that's September. But, I wanted to pick up on Eric's point. 2 points. One, that it is, not only carbon capture, there's actually a huge amount of uncertainty across a lot of these technologies, right? Everything from prices of electricity and adoption, what the heat pumps, deliver or don't deliver, what the batteries do, what the transmission, sort of like assumptions about renewables with and without, sort of like certain investments in transmission. And so I think one of our challenges is there is a huge amount of uncertainty, which I think is important to say, both based on policy and technology about how far you can go with different, which is why it's, I think, really important to have different scenarios, because we honestly, and we looked at this in gas, and looking at electrification and decarbonization of natural gas, fuels, it's incredibly hard to know which way things are going to work out, right? And a lot of, which led a lot of folks to say, look, we probably need to hedge our bets. We need to have multiple options because it's not clear that, there's no one path that is clearly proven. And I think the other is, around something like carbon capture, I think there's an opportunity for education on that, because there's actually quite a bit, just one example, there's a carbon capture pipeline that's a $4.5 billion investment that's been proposed that would capture carbon from ethanol. And that technology is already here. Like, that's not even hard technology. And it pays for itself in terms of producing lower carbon fuels. And so there is a viable, already has investors, has customers project that probably will be operational in 3 years. And last person I talked to is like, it might amount to 1 or 2% of all of our carbon emissions in the state, which would be bigger than any single facility we have in the state in terms of making progress on climate goals. But it's not a conversation that we've heard about a lot. A lot's known about wind and solar, a lot less about carbon capture. And I feel like one of the jobs we need to do is look at the other technologies that are out there and understand how do those fit in, what are the challenges, what additional supports would help us accomplish with these other technologies what we're at with wind and solar, which have some constraints and limitations as well.
Any other things that you want to share that you're learning from your work in the work groups, or things that might be helpful to your colleagues in other work groups? I know that the Economic Opportunities Group has had a bunch of conversations, so hopefully that's helpful to the other two groups who are just getting started there to hear, but I think it's really interesting to hear from the health economic, a lot of government, lots of words in our names, right? From the Equity, Health, and Communities Group that they added folks to their group, which is different, and how that's working. And from the Natural and Working Lands Group has been really thoughtful about how they're framing this work so that it appeals to a really wide array of folks, and a really diverse group of folks can see themselves and the benefits to them in this work. So I think it's just really interesting to see the different focus areas of the work groups. Any other thoughts on work groups? Chris?
I just pass along maybe a couple more comments. One, we did hear where some of the folks we've been talking to feel like there have been some gaps in opportunities to connect people with what we're pursuing, and some suggestions about how to incorporate ideas and be open to ideas before identifying challenges. And I know that many projects come with challenges, so it's easy to start identifying those. We try to use a rule in our business that we love every idea for 15 minutes, which is basically a gentle reminder that when somebody's bringing an idea forward, they've spent some time thinking about it. So before we tell them why it won't work, we at least hear them out and all think about how it might work. But we also heard, we heard about some gaps. So I think there's some opportunities for feedback to help close those gaps. But we did hear many compliments from people when they deal with the day-to-day interactions with the agencies. I heard it about PCA, heard it about MnDOT, heard it about weights and measures at Commerce. And, that's been the experience of our business too. So we have several commissioners on here. I just wanted to pass that along because, I think it's always good when some of the criticism is shared that you get the compliments too. So I just wanted to make sure that you heard those as well.
Thanks, Chris. Anything else on work groups? All right, we've got one more section of our agenda to wrap together everything we've heard today, and Commissioner Margaret Anderson Kelleher from the Department of Transportation is going to lead us in that conversation. Commissioner?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm glad to be with you. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you for the first hour. I was doing actually a presentation on technology at MnDOT, and it is closely, of course, related to climate issues as well. So thanks for letting me join in and participate. I've been enjoying hearing your conversation and the questions that have been raised. I want to say that I think this portion of the agenda is really going to help focus us. I want to, again, I know the governor thanked you for your time, and Commissioner Tester thanked you for your time, but it's really important. You are experts in each of your own fields. You're connected to other experts, as we heard about the committee expansion process. And one of the things we want to do at the end of the meeting here is, we've identified both some challenges and some real opportunities going forward. And the state's response to those challenges and opportunities through the climate action framework, it's important to us to have you do some thinking together with us about your talents, your skills and resources. Is there other work you're willing to possibly engage into on climate action, and being able to kind of bring these things together? And we will be keeping track of people's ideas here. But I heard Anne say some things earlier about well, what are the sort of things that might be being planned? You mentioned capital investment, the bonding process, but I think there's probably both things outside of that and related to it that might be interesting for you to all talk about here, that could really be action focused, a little more sort of put the detail around it. I guess that's what we're looking for. And even if you can't yourself completely make that happen, we want to hear it so that we know how to connect others into that work, or we can do the follow-up with you and do that work side by side. So I think that's where we want to go. We want to take that committee work, the opportunities and challenges, and talk about some specifics here of things both reacting to the framework, but also maybe things that you didn't hear that you've been thinking about during this meeting today. And so Mariah and I are going to jointly facilitate this section of it. We have actually taught together in the past on facilitation and negotiation, so we're a good team on that. And looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And I will let the awkward silence sit until someone starts speaking.
I'll just give folks a couple of reminders. So if you remember back to the slide that Amanda had at the end of the presentation, there were some different ideas there about how you might advise us on the framework, from the specific policy items to the arc of that work to the engagement approach that we're taking. So there were some ideas there about how you might advise us, and then other ideas. I mentioned earlier in the conversation, I think the idea that I think your advice might be particularly helpful once we've gathered some of this feedback and we're trying to prioritize. It won't do anyone any good for us to have a list of every possible policy, right? It's not a framework for action. And so helping us think through what's important to Minnesotans and what are those important trade-offs as we prioritize, that might be a place for you to advise us. And then there's kind of the collaboration, which is the work that you've been doing so far around having these conversations with folks. There were pieces there on that slide around helping promote activity around Climate Week, helping promote activity around when the draft framework is released in January, those climate conversations. But there might be any number of other ways for us to use your skills and talents around engaging folks, around bringing resources to this work, around advocacy, coalition building. So we're curious at this point in our work together and in your work in the work groups and with the comments from the governor and what we know about the legislative session, what do you want to lean into at this point? And I see Alex has her hand up.
So my recommendation on that at this point is, we've been working together for about a year, and I think you kind of know our backgrounds and our interests at this point. So I think it actually might be most fruitful if particular agency heads or people on the action team reached out to us individually and said, hey, we're putting together a meeting on this. We're going to try to work through this part of the framework. We'd love to have you join us if you have the time and inclination. I mean, all of us, volunteered and applied to be on the advisory council. So obviously we want to devote our time. And I think to some extent, many of us just want to be asked. And it may be that, you guessed wrong and the response is, well, I'm actually much more interested, in this particular issue. So why don't you, connect me with them? But I think you're mostly going to guess right at this point because, again, our background, our interests. So that would be my suggestion as to how to engage us more. I think we're often looking for, what do you want from us? What kind of advice do you want from us? We're happy to give that, but just want to be asked. That's my, individual perspective, and obviously other folks on the advisory council can say otherwise or agree.
Thanks for that. I'm going to go to Anne Mulholland next.
Well, there you go. I was talking away. So thanks, Alex, for that. Just to build on your comment, Alex.
You went back on mute there, Anne.
I feel like something's clicking me off. No, the computer doesn't want me to talk, so I'll look at that again. Sorry about that. But I'm thinking a little bit about the legislative session and how we can help agencies develop really, really bold agendas. And I talked a little bit about bonding earlier because I've been really appreciative of the bold bonding requests, the preliminary requests that are out there now. And I think those are important. And they, maybe if we can help kind of reinforce those and think beyond the bonding requests with agencies, that would be another area that I think would be of interest. So I would love to dive into that, and I know that others would as well. But I think bonding and beyond, as you said, Commissioner Kelleher, that getting even beyond that would be wonderful. So thank you.
Great, excellent. Both very good points. We might be wrong on your interest in a particular area, but you'll hopefully help direct us to other folks who have that interest area. And I think that, to Anne, your point, bonding is a slice of the pie. In the transportation world, we were having a good rousing debate on Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., 7:30 a.m. about trees and about MnDOT's commitment to also work on that. And I'll tell you, it's not always easy within agencies to move the work on climate, but I think having the healthy debate is really important, and then pushing further. So I think that's a great option to have you look at, to invite some folks in from the outside to look at what is our 20-year need here, and how would we fulfill both a mission around sustainability, climate, and equity. And that's an excellent point. Others? Chris, I see you came off of mute. So
yeah, you're watching closely, Commissioner. I think a couple of ideas I would throw out are looking for those opportunities for public-private partnerships, or looking for places where we can pilot and try ideas in the state. There were a couple of links to that, of providing opportunities to both put people to work as we come out of COVID, and to use assets that have been more idle because of COVID. So you may have some willing partners and some willingness to experiment, as we've all been through the pandemic experience. The other thing that I think, when just thinking about the competition with other states, is making sure that we're identifying places where we can put Minnesota as the place to come experiment. And I know on the connected and automated vehicle front, there's been quite a bit of thinking about that. But perhaps in other areas, there are places where we can find things to showcase in Minnesota. And then, I think it was said earlier, playoff opportunities to maybe chase some federal money with that. And then, I think that I know there's a million things going on, and I'm always amazed at how full schedules are, including the schedules of the agencies and the staff working on different dockets. It's just amazing what all gets processed. But I think if you had some sort of a secret box to put in where people are finding barriers, or maybe not even a so secret box, just a place to be able to take that. You say you want to do X, but then over here, you're actually inhibiting doing X. Do you even know you're doing that? And I think that came through in a couple of the interviews, and I know occasionally we feel that way too. And I get it with big organizations, sometimes that you can actually have an overall policy and then not know you're working against it in a smaller section of your business. So those are a few thoughts. On the public-private partnership, I continue to believe the way Minnesota has approached conservation and energy efficiency has lessons for us as we look at things like building out a charging network and help getting past the chicken or the egg on some of these infrastructure investments, and have an opportunity to put people to work. So those are a few thoughts.
Thank you for those thoughts. Really excellent contributions to where we might be looking to, and I think a very good point that in some cases there's even some things that government can't do that we really do. We need the private sector to work side by side with us on some of the implementation. Also love the pilot idea. I mean, I think that having, and maybe that's part of the work groups going forward is, can maybe the work groups come up with a couple of pilot ideas for us even, to see if here's something you've heard about, not just in the United States, but I think around the world. I mean, we need to look globally at what's working well, or people are trying to, replicate. So I think that's a good point. Others? Trying to get, yeah, Alex.
Alex, I guess just one more point. I think we also shouldn't forget about some of the nonprofits that we have in the state of Minnesota that are already doing a lot of public-private engagement and trying to build stakeholder connections. Like we talked to the Drive Electric folks at the Great Plains Institute. That's a lot of what they do. So I would hate for us to spend a lot of time, and the agencies spend a lot of time kind of recreating the wheel when we can, work with them and kind of build on some of the partnerships that they've already started. I know they'd be thrilled to help. That was, the message that came through in our stakeholder interview. And, I'm just using them as an example because we talked to them last week, but, there's other groups like that as well. And so, I would really encourage you to, reach out to them and feel free to, use us as a liaison or to be part of a working group like that.
Excellent point. I will just say from the Sustainable Transportation Advisory Committee the governor has appointed, they are on it. They are actually doing a lot of modeling for us. So we are engaged. I think it's interesting, maybe some of the groups that you may have run across or will run across that are maybe more those medium to small size groups that state government may not be aware of. Those are interesting, right? Because the Great Plains Institute is well known here and very involved at the Department of Transportation, at least, and I think at Commerce as well. But it's finding new partners, I think, to work with us. So it's a great idea. I think we could do even more of that. I want to just acknowledge that their folks have been pretty darn involved at transportation as we've been working on the decarbonizing the transportation sector report and making that operational.
Commissioner, I might add one more thing too. I would be remiss if I didn't kind of follow up. The governor said something powerful about really needing to build that bipartisan support. Climate, it's going to require all of us, and that gets uncomfortable for folks. And we have to make space for everyone to have a voice and a role in climate. And I'm wondering I'm thinking about some examples of where that's happened. And even, this year it happened and the governor commented on those places it did. But I think a lot about, some of our work in conservation has been successful because we have brought along folks that might not agree with everything that we as a conservation organization are a part of, but agree with big chunks of what we care about. So I'm real interested in seeing how we can be supportive and helpful for the governor and for you as commissioners in helping bridge this partisan divide, because the only way we're going to move forward on climate change in Minnesota is with both major political parties.
Absolutely. It's a great point. And we probably can do some thinking as our sub cabinet about what that looks like and kind of what our needs are.
I think some of the early places that we've identified for that is the conversations that you're having right now. That's a huge focus of that work. The piece about prioritizing and building consensus about what ultimately ends up in the framework is a piece of that. Those climate conversations that Amanda mentioned, which we haven't spent much time talking about, but we will, about getting kind of neighbors to have conversations with each other about climate and the roles that you all can play there. So I think there's a number of pieces in that space, and we know that that's a space that we need your help. So for sure, that piece. And to the earlier points about, weighing in on the specific content of the framework, if any of you are interested in really leaning in, if you want to reach out to Frank, he will gladly connect you with an action team and make sure that we're able to hear your really detailed feedback about that area of what we're putting into the framework, as well as just making sure that you're connected to that specific area for doing things like inviting you to meetings and identifying other places. So just let us know. We don't want to make assumptions that you want to do more than these meetings, but if you do, then we would love to have you. So let Frank know specifically about that, as well as we spend quite a bit of time at these meetings talking about the engagement and the arc of the engagement work. But if you want to drill even deeper into that and have even more specific feedback or want to lean in even more, we can also connect you to Amanda and Faith and the team that's working on some of those details. And always, if you have ideas, we do try to articulate where we can use your help. And that's a lot of around the pieces that Anne was just talking about. And we'll continue to bring forth requests as well. And if you have ideas as well, please reach out at any time.
Mariah, I have a question. Is there a latest version of the framework? Because I think the last one you shared with us was 2 months ago. So has that been updated, or that's the last one?
Yeah, so the thing that I would use right now is what's up on the climate website. So
Okay.
that's a really high level summary.
Okay.
The rest of that, some of the drafts that you've seen are really drafty and not very user friendly. And so, it's been a theme on this call is that we hear a lot of requests for specificity, like how can we help you? We can't respond if we don't know what you're talking about. Climate is sort of everything. And on the other hand, we also hear a lot of feedback about, come to us early, don't develop things without talking to us. And so we're always trying to find the sweet spot there. So I think right now, what's on the website is the most useful piece. And then we're going to be getting all that feedback, all those details. And as we sort through that and get to that draft of the framework that we'll release in January, then we'll want your help in, reviewing all of that and coming up with the final draft.
Mariah, I would add to that, though, if you are interested to see where a particular action team is with their part of this framework, that is one thing we've been talking with them of being able to show more of the work. It's really just comes down to what is digestible and useful for fostering conversations. So if there are areas, that your work group or you individually want to know more about, as Mariah said, let me know, and we will connect those action teams and be more than willing to show our work, where we're at, as ugly as it may be and confusing as it may be right now, but really get your hands into that and provide the feedback that you'd like to provide if you're so interested. Again, we don't want to make assumptions that everyone wants to get into that level of detail, but if you are interested or someone in your organization is interested, we're willing to have those conversations in the action team.
Yeah, or if you're meeting with somebody who really wants, is really telling you, I need more specifics, we could give you that document for you to say, here's some of the things that are really being considered right now. So again, Frank is probably the best channel for that to then connect you to the right action team that has that higher level of specificity around particular policy areas. Any other thoughts about where we go from here? We'll keep, iterating as we go for sure. We're going to be focusing on the conversations that you all are having right now, which are off to a really great start. But any other thoughts about the conversations that you're having as work groups, connecting with action teams, or any other work of the advisory council? Hearing
Okay.
that. Yeah, great.
I think we'll close. I just want to thank everyone for their time, for their brain power that they're putting into this, their ability to connect with others across the state. We know how important that is. And we appreciate the ideas you're bringing towards the administration as well. We want to celebrate what a very, very good year it was in the legislative session. Even though there are barriers, it was a good year. We've got to do more though, and we know that. I mean, I'm sure many of you feel like I feel, are we doing enough fast enough? And, that I think is really the dilemma we all face right now, is that there's so many things that need to happen all at once that it can sometimes overwhelm. So a conversation like today, I'll just say for myself, really uplifts the work we're doing at the Department of Transportation and across this administration, and helps kind of put a little more fuel, green fuel in my tank to be able to keep it moving. And, we've suffered losses in the administration that were political this past year, including our very good friend, Commissioner Bishop. And so I know we need to be both humble, but also fierce in the work that we're doing. We have one planet, we have one shot at turning this around. And we need to have all of you and more working with us side by side. So I just want to say, from the administration standpoint, on behalf of the governor and lieutenant governor, again, thank you so very much for spending your precious time with us. It's one of the most valuable resources we all have. And I hope that if you are willing to engage more with any one of us, we will ask, but also please feel free to nudge us as well about particular items you want to know more about. When this federal bill is finally released, which I will say has been a long time coming, we don't know what's in it, but I do think there's going to be some very positive things for the work we're doing together. So look forward to seeing all of you in person, but also continuing the work that we're doing together. And thank you, Mariah, for helping facilitate and work with us. And to all my fellow commissioners, thank you for all of your time, and all the staff who does amazing work to get ready for these meetings and then takes the information and works again with it. So thanks so much, everybody. I think we can close.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.